After his charitable work wrapped up sooner than anticipated, the millionaire returned home hoping to surprise his daughter and wife. But the moment he walked in, he was confronted with a sight in the kitchen that absolutely astonished him about what his little girl was doing. 2 o'clock in the morning. The sleek black Lincoln sedan glided to a stop in front of the gate of the Miller family estate. The purr of the engine ceased, surrendering the Chicago night to profound silence. Jonathan Miller stepped out, pulling the collar of his overcoat high against the bone-chilling wind sweeping in from Lake Michigan. His South American trip had wrapped up a week early. He had envisioned a warm reception, perhaps a nice glass of Cabernet, and finally collapsing into sleep next to his beautiful wife. Instead, the house greeted him with a chilling stillness like a tomb. Jonathan hauled his suitcase into the main foyer. The automatic sensor lights didn't spring to life. There was no joyful barking from their golden retriever, just thick darkness and a persistent cold seeping through his clothes. Jonathan frowned, reaching for the thermostat on the wall. The screen was blank. The central heating system was off. He walked through the living room, the leather soles of his shoes clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. Moonlight streaming through the windows revealed the rare orchids that Tiffany, his wife, always bragged about caring for. Now their leaves were withered and dropping onto the carpet. A vague sense of unease began to settle in Jonathan's stomach, but the intense thirst following his long flight drew him toward the kitchen. The expansive kitchen was shrouded in gloom, save for a weak blue glow spilling from the slightly ajar refrigerator door. Jonathan froze. Along with the light came strange sounds, rapid, harsh, chewing, the rustling tear of packaging material. Was it an intruder, or perhaps the dog scavenging for food? He tiptoed closer, holding his breath, peering through the gap in the door. Sitting right on the cold tile floor was a small figure. Abby. His 8-year-old daughter, usually seen in meticulously tailored dresses and neat braids, was now wearing thin pajamas stained with smudges. Her hair was tangled, falling across part of her gaunt face. Abby was devouring food voraciously. With her bare hands, she grabbed slices of cold cuts from the deli drawer, hastily stuffing them into her mouth along with shredded cheese. She swallowed without properly chewing, tears streaming down her cheeks, mixing with the food. Instinctively, Jonathan's elbow brushed against the light switch on the wall. The overhead lights flared to life, blindingly bright. Abby jumped. She didn't turn around, nor did she run to embrace her father. Her first reaction was to drop the piece of meat in her hand, curl up, and scramble backward into the corner where the refrigerator met the kitchen counter. Abby clamped her hands over her head, her entire body trembling uncontrollably, as if bracing for a harsh reprimand. "I'm sorry. I was hungry. Please don't confine me to the dark room again. I promise I won't do it anymore." Her feeble whispers felt like needles piercing Jonathan's heart. He realized with a crushing wave of pain that his daughter didn't recognize him. She only saw pure, overwhelming fear. "Abby, it's Daddy. It's Jonathan." Jonathan knelt, his voice cracking. Abby slowly peeked through the gap in her fingers. When she recognized her father's familiar face, the sheer terror in her deep-set eyes shifted to astonishment, then burst into a choked sob. Yet she still didn't dare rush into his arms. Her large, frightened eyes darted around the kitchen, desperately searching for any sign of Tiffany. Tiffany's absence now felt suspicious and profoundly unsettling. Jonathan moved closer, placing a hand on his daughter's stomach. Underneath her thin nightclothes, the hollow, desperate churning of an empty stomach resonated mournfully. "Where is your mother, Tiffany? Why are you this hungry?" "Where is Grandma?" Abby tremblingly pointed toward the pantry door. Jonathan followed her gaze. The elegant oak pantry door was now secured with a crude iron chain and a massive padlock, something that certainly hadn't been there before he left. Jonathan swept his daughter into his arms. Her body temperature felt alarmingly low. He glanced upstairs toward where the warm nightlights should have been shining from the master bedroom and his mother's suite. Abby clung tightly to the expensive lapel of her father's suit jacket, her tiny fingers grasping her sole source of hope. She shook her head, pointed upward toward the ceiling, then brought a finger to her lips, signaling silence. Her lips, slightly blue, faintly mouthed a silent confession. "Nobody's here, Daddy." Mommy went away. She said she went to find freedom. What about Grandma Jonathan's question dissolved into the cold quiet? Abby didn't answer. She slipped down from his arms, took his little finger, and tugged him toward the staircase. Her steps were hesitant, but she resolutely led him toward the hallway that branched off to Martha's room. His mother's room, situated at the end of the hall, normally kept wide open for nurses and family access, was now tightly sealed. A brand new, chillingly polished padlock had been added to the outside. Father and daughter stood before the door. Abby let go of her father's hand, stepped back a few paces, covered her ears tightly, and squeezed her eyes shut, as if anticipating some horrific sound to emanate from within. Before his business trip, Jonathan had personally given strict instructions to the nursing staff and Tiffany that his mother's door was never to be locked. His mother had been partially paralyzed after a stroke the previous year. She required immediate medical access. This shiny new padlock was a cruel declaration of isolation. Jonathan pressed his ear against the thick oak door. "Mother, can you hear me?" No reply. No familiar whirring sound of the oxygen machine. No painful groans caused by aching joints when the weather changed. Only a thick, heavy silence, as if a vacant grave lay inside. Jonathan's hand tightened on the doorknob. He stood frozen, a surge of memories washing over him, vivid and painful. He recalled that morning just before leaving for the airport. Tiffany stood at this very door, holding a bowl of oatmeal, smiling tenderly at him. "You go save the world, honey. Everything's under control here at home. Mother is my responsibility. She's my mother too. I won't let her want for anything." Jonathan had believed her. He had kissed his wife's forehead, touched by her devotion. He had smugly thought that his money and his choices were flawless. But now, looking at that dreadful padlock, he saw that smile warp, morphing into a sharp dagger aimed at his pride and his heart. His blind faith was complicity. "Daddy." "Grandma's been asleep for a really long time." Abby's tiny voice from behind him pulled Jonathan back to the present. He looked at his daughter shivering at the top of the stairs, then back at the door. He couldn't hesitate any longer. Jonathan backed up a few steps to build momentum. He gritted his teeth, channeling all his strength into his right shoulder, and collided powerfully with the door. Thud. The door rattled violently but didn't break open. The oak was tougher than he expected. A sharp ache flared in his shoulder, but the fear of what lay inside was infinitely greater. A second time, the bolt began to buckle, and the dry, cracking sound of splitting wood echoed. "Open up!" Jonathan roared, charging a third time with the desperation of a son. Crash! The door flew inward, slamming against the wall. Immediately, a blast of stifling heat rushed out, hitting Jonathan full in the face. The room, sealed off from ventilation for days during the summer without air conditioning, had become a sauna. But the heat wasn't the worst part. It was the foul odor. The smell of bodily waste left unattended, the pungent, sour smell of stale urine, the musty odor of decaying food, and the scent of slow degradation of life. All of it merged into a distinct stench of neglect, stinging his nose and lungs, making Jonathan nearly gag. He instinctively brought a hand to cover his nose, his eyes watering. Behind him, the soft thump-thump of tiny feet running down the stairs faded. Abby had fled. She couldn't endure the scent of this hellish place. Jonathan held his breath and stepped inside. The dim yellow light from the hallway illuminated the hospital bed placed in the center of the room. Martha lay at the edge of the bed like a forgotten child. The sheets and pillows were crumpled and smeared with dark brown stains. She lay motionless, her back to the door. Jonathan held his breath, watching his mother's chest. It rose and fell weakly, her breathing shallow and broken, as fragile as a flickering candle. He rushed to the bedside. Mom. The bedside table was empty. No cup of water, no vial of blood pressure or heart medication she took daily. Jonathan looked down at the floor. A plastic food tray sat right at the foot of the bed with a bowl of soup on it, now solidified green with mold and dry. It had been there for at least 3 or 4 days. How could a partially paralyzed person reach the floor for food? Jonathan touched his mother's forehead. Her skin was burning hot like fire, but when he grasped her thin bony hand, it was icy cold. Her lips were cracked dry and bleeding. She was severely dehydrated. "Mother, I'm home. It's Jonathan." He called out, his voice choked with emotion. Martha didn't react. Her eyes were sealed shut, her sockets deep and shadowed. She was unconscious. Jonathan's hand trembled as he pulled his phone from his suit pocket. He dialed the emergency hotline of his own hospital, the place where he was chairman, the place he always proudly claimed offered premier care. "Emergency send. A specialized unit to the Miller residence immediately. Female patient, 70 unconscious, suspected septic shock. Bring a ventilator. Hurry. If you are 1 minute late, I will terminate every job in that hospital." He shouted into the phone, his voice ragged with panic and fury. On the other end, the operator recognized the CEO's voice and instantly issued an urgent dispatch. Jonathan tossed the phone onto the bed. He couldn't just stand there watching his mother slowly expire. He ran into the bathroom, soaking a washcloth with cold water. Wringing it out, he gently dabbed her cracked lips. As the water touched her, her lips twitched slightly like the reflex of a parched plant finally meeting rain. He carefully turned her onto her side to wipe the sweat that was pouring down her brow. And then he saw her back. Her gown was drenched and sticking to her skin. When he lifted the gown, a horrifying sight met his eyes. Bed sores. Areas of skin on her back and hips were necrotic red and weeping fluid. These were pressure ulcers, a clear sign that the patient had been lying in the same position for far too long without being turned. A week. At least a week she had lain still in this position on her own waist, in this stifling heat, waiting for death to claim her. Oh my goodness. Tiffany. "What have you done?" Jonathan growled deep in his throat, tears welling up. He wasn't crying from sorrow. He was crying from the pure, scorching hatred that consumed him. The distant wail of sirens ripped through the quiet night outside the mansion. The shriek of tires burning rubber sounded in the front driveway. The main door was shoved open. The heavy thump-thump of feet raced up the stairs. The medical team in white coats carrying stretchers and equipment flooded into the room. The dead stillness was shattered by professional shouts, the urgent beeping of the monitor, and the tearing sound of sterile packaging. Blood pressure critically low, heart rate unstable, prepare for intubation, high-speed IV fluids. Where's the adrenaline? Jonathan backed away, pressing himself against the wall to give the doctor space. He watched them cut away his mother's soiled clothing, inserting IV lines into her thin, bruised arms. He watched them lift her onto the stretcher, placing the oxygen mask over her ashen face. They rushed downstairs. Jonathan followed. At the foot of the stairs, Abby was huddled beside the elderly housekeeper who had just been awakened by the sirens and stood blinking dazedly in her rumpled nightgown. "Take care of her. Don't let anyone in the house until I call." Jonathan commanded the housekeeper curtly, not even pausing to look at Abby one last time. He climbed into the ambulance right after his mother's stretcher. The vehicle door slammed shut. The ambulance sped away into the night, its flashing lights swirling over the trees lining the road. Jonathan sat next to the stretcher, clutching his mother's icy hand. His eyes were glued to the heart monitor screen. The faint green waves danced weakly, flickering like a candle in a gale. Each feeble beat of Martha's heart was like a sledgehammer blow against Jonathan's chest. He leaned down, kissing the back of her hand, tasting the bitter salt of sweat and tears. In his mind now, there were no images of his beautiful wife or grand philanthropic schemes. There was only one single thought forming sharp and cold. Retribution. Someone had to pay the ultimate price for every pressure sore on his mother's back. The siren that tore through the night had long since faded, leaving behind an even more chilling silence in the VIP emergency hallway of Miller Hospital. Jonathan stood rooted outside the thick isolation glass, his bloodshot eyes fixed on the hurried white-coated figures within. The cold operating light shone down, reflecting his haggard face on the glass. Inside, his mother, a woman who had worked tirelessly her whole life, was now small and lost amidst a tangle of IV tubes and the dull, indifferent beep-beep of the life support machine. Each pulse of the heart monitor was a hammer stroke driving into Jonathan's chest, reminding him of the fragility of the thread of life his mother desperately clung to. The emergency room door clicked open. The head physician stepped out, pulling down his surgical mask to reveal a face etched with weary lines. He didn't meet Jonathan's eyes right away, instead looking down at the patient's chart again, his heavy sigh drifting into the space. Dr. Roberts, Jonathan spoke first, his voice gravelly. "My mother. How is she holding up, doctor?" Roberts looked up, his gaze holding an unvarnished reproach for his chairman. "We have stabilized the basic vital signs, but the situation is still dire, Jonathan. She's in acute septic shock from a urinary tract infection." Jonathan took a step back, gripping the waiting room bench. "Infection, but our house is always kept pristine. The problem isn't the house." Dr. Roberts cut him off, his voice low but sharp. "Her kidneys are failing severely from dehydration. Her body is withered like a plant forgotten in the desert." "Jonathan, you're in the medical field. You know how much water a bedridden person requires. If you had arrived just 2 hours later, her heart would have given out from circulatory collapse. 2 hours. Just 2 hours more, and he would have been an accomplice in his mother's death." Jonathan ran a hand over his face, trying to erase the image of the foul-smelling room. He remembered Tiffany's firm promise before he boarded the plane. "I hired private care." Private. Tiffany said she had hired an experienced head nurse from the center to be on duty 24/7. Perhaps she neglected her duties. Dr. Roberts shook his head, a wry smile appearing on his lips. "There was no nurse, Jonathan. I checked the entire entry and exit log system as well as the records for outpatient care for both our hospital and linked private services. No one has been hired under the Miller family name in the past 2 weeks. No one updated her status, no one changed her dressings, and certainly no one gave her a drink of water." The doctor's words were like a bucket of icy water splashed onto Jonathan's face, washing away the fog of blind trust he had enveloped himself in for so long. "You mean, for the past 10 days, my mother was lying there, alone, and in agony?" Dr. Roberts flipped to the next page of the chart, pointing to the stark red notes. "The bed sores on her back and hips have progressed to stage 3 necrosis. Do you know what that means? It means she hasn't been turned in at least a week. She lay still in her own waste, waiting for someone to open the door, but no one came." Jonathan couldn't listen anymore. He slumped onto the waiting bench, burying his face in his hands, running them through his disheveled hair. Silence enveloped the corridor, broken only by the cold hum of the air conditioning. "I'll check on her again in an hour. You should prepare yourself." Dr. Roberts patted his shoulder and turned to walk away, leaving Jonathan isolated with the raw, brutal truth. He sat there overwhelmed by loneliness. He was the CEO of a medical empire, a man who traveled the world to bring life to strangers' children, yet he allowed his own mother to slowly perish in a multi-million-dollar mansion. He had trusted Tiffany too much. He had let her deceptive sweetness lull his common sense to sleep. The phone in his pocket vibrated with a soft jingle, signaling a junk text, but it was enough to pull Jonathan from his despair. He pulled out the phone. The screen lit up, displaying the family photo wallpaper himself, Tiffany and Abby smiling brightly. But now Tiffany's smile in the photo looked twisted and calculating. Jonathan's finger hovered over his wife's phone number. He wanted to call. He wanted to scream at her, to ask her why she had done it. Why did she lie about the nurse? Why did she secure his mother's door? But then a memory flashed through his mind. It was the evening before his trip. Abby had run up to him with a tablet, wanting to show him a drawing she had made, but Tiffany had quickly snatched the device away, saying children shouldn't use technology too much. At the time, he had just shrugged it off, but Tiffany's eyes they held a hint of panic. Jonathan unlocked his phone, but didn't make the call. He opened Instagram. Not the official Mrs. Miller account full of virtuous posts and charity updates that he frequently liked. He recalled once accidentally seeing Tiffany scrolling through another very unusual account name. She had said it was just for following fashion trends. He typed the characters he had inadvertently memorized into the search bar. A private account appeared, Tiff Unleashed. Jonathan held his breath and clicked. The most recent post flashed onto the screen, hitting him like a physical blow. The picture was saturated with the dazzling sunlight of a tropical region, a stark contrast to the sterile, mournful white of the hospital. In the photo, Tiffany was stretched out on a sun lounger by an infinity pool with the characteristic turquoise ocean of Mexico stretching out behind her. She wore a vibrant red bikini, holding a salt-rimmed margarita glass, smiling radiantly, her head resting on the shoulder of a strange man whose body was partially cropped, only a tan-tattooed arm was visible. Jonathan read the caption underneath, swallowing each word like broken glass. Freedom. Finally escaping the stinky nursing home and the noisy daycare, enjoying 7 days of genuine single life. Single vibes, Nacra, Mexico. Freedom Time posted 5 days ago, meaning just 2 days after he had stepped onto the plane for South America. Jonathan looked up, gazing through the glass into the recovery room. His mother lay there struggling for every breath against death, her skin broken and infected from neglect. And his wife, the devoted daughter-in-law he boasted about to the press, was raising a toast to her freedom at a 5-star resort thousands of miles away. Stinky nursing home. Jonathan muttered the phrase aloud. The blood in his veins felt like it was boiling, rushing against his temples. The grief and regret of moments ago suddenly evaporated, replaced by a chilling calm. This wasn't a sudden burst of anger, but the stillness preceding a massive storm. His fingers were no longer shaking. He didn't press the call button. He pressed the screenshot button, 1 shot, 2 shots, 3 shots. He saved all the posts, the congratulatory comments from her partying friends, and all the check-in photos at luxurious bars taken during the days his mother was dying of thirst. Jonathan turned off the phone screen, slowly tucking it into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, right next to the heart that was now beating with grim determination. He wouldn't call. A questioning call now would be too merciful. It would give her a chance to prepare her lies to play the victim, or worse, to escape. No, he needed her to come back. He needed her to walk right into the trap that her own greed and cruelty had set. Jonathan stood up, adjusting his shirt collar. He looked at his reflection in the hallway window glass. The man with the compassionate, sorrowful eyes from last night was gone. Standing there now was a son preparing to demand justice, a father ready to do anything to protect his own flesh and blood. He turned to his assistant, who had just rushed in with a stack of files. "Quash all news about my early return. Any newspaper that gets a sniff of it, buy the story at any price." Jonathan commanded, his voice strangely calm. "Yes, sir." "And what about Mrs. Miller? Don't mention her." Jonathan cut him off, his eyes razor sharp. "Contact my personal attorney and the head of my security team. I need them at the residence tonight, and hire 2 bodyguards immediately to stand guard outside this hospital room 24/7. No one is to be allowed to visit my mother, not even my wife, without my direct permission." The assistant shivered at the intensity radiating from his boss, quickly nodding and taking notes. Jonathan turned to look at his mother one last time through the glass. "I'll clean up our house, Mother," he whispered like a solemn oath. The sky was beginning to brighten. The first rays of sun pierced through the hospital windows, weak, but signaling the start of a new day. Jonathan turned and walked away, the sound of his leather shoes hitting the tile floor, rhythmic and resolute. The black car was waiting in the lobby below. Jonathan got into the back seat, signaling the driver to move. The car slid away in the early morning fog, leaving the sterile white hospital behind, rushing toward the lakeside mansion where the darkest secrets still lay dormant in the shadows, waiting for his hand to pull them into the light. The plan for retribution was now activated, but the most heartbreaking secret still lingered in that cold mansion. How would Jonathan confront the scars on his daughter, turn to find the answer? The car halted just as the first rays of sunlight pierced the leaves, illuminating the gravel road outside the mansion gates. Jonathan opened the door. The morning air still held the chill of the fading night, but the gloom had lifted somewhat. He held Abby's hand and led her inside. He took her to the kitchen. The empty refrigerator of the night before was now filled by his dedicated assistant with all sorts of fresh, neatly arranged food. Jonathan rolled up the sleeves of his shirt and began preparing a simple breakfast. The clanking of knives on the cutting board, the bubbling of soup on the stove, these ordinary sounds had been absent from this kitchen for the past 2 years, ever since he became busy with his mission to save the world. Abby sat on a high chair, her legs swinging without touching the floor. Her large, innocent eyes were glued to the steaming bowl of chicken soup in front of her, but she hadn't yet dared to pick up the spoon. Jonathan noticed that she kept glancing up at the corner of the ceiling where a small smoke detector was mounted. "Eat up, sweetie." "The soup is warm." Jonathan gently pushed the bowl closer to her. Abby pulled her hands back slightly and then cautiously picked up the spoon. In stark contrast to the frantic hunger of the previous night, she ate in small, slow, and wary spoonfuls, as if afraid that any noise she made would result in a punishment. Halfway through the bowl, Abby suddenly stopped. She quickly glanced at her father, then swiftly took a paper napkin and carefully wrapped the remaining half-slice of toast on her plate. The action was swift and practiced heartbreakingly precise, like a survival habit honed over time. She slipped the wrapped toast into her jacket pocket, then sat still, her hands neatly folded on her lap. Jonathan was stunned. He reached out and gently grasped her thin wrist. "Why are you hiding food? I can make you more." Abby winced, her voice barely a whisper. "Aunt Tiffany said our family's having hard times. Daddy works so hard to help the poor children. I have to save money." She nervously pointed towards the stack of charity magazines Jonathan kept on the corner table in the living room. The cover showed images of malnourished children in some distant country he was sponsoring. Auntie said, "Every piece of meat I eat is taking a life from another child. If I eat a lot, they will starve. I don't want to be a bad person." Jonathan felt as if someone had punched him hard in the stomach. He realized that his own showy benevolence, the high honors he received, had all been weaponized by Tiffany, turned into a sharp tool for the psychological torment of his own daughter. She had manufactured a horror story, turning him into a strict saint and his daughter into a sinner for having the most basic human needs. Then, "Why didn't you call me?" Jonathan asked. His voice choked. Abby looked down her shoulders, trembling. "Auntie said your phone is the emergency hotline for saving people. She said if I called to bother you about trivial things like being hungry or missing you, you would be distracted." The spoon in Jonathan's hand dropped onto the table, the metallic clatter jarringly loud. He looked into his daughter's clear, terrified eyes, realizing he had inadvertently become the bogeyman in his own home. The outside glamour had become the very bars of a prison confining his child's spirit. Jonathan shot to his feet. He walked around the table, wrapping his arms tightly around his daughter from behind, burying his face in her soft hair that still smelled of the early morning. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Abby." Jonathan quickly walked to the landline phone placed in the corner of the room. He yanked out the cord, then threw the entire phone into the trash can right in front of Abby. "Listen to me, Abby." Jonathan knelt, looking directly into her eyes, his voice more resolute than ever. "No phone call is more important than you. No child out there is more important than you. Daddy is here for you. You can eat as much as you want, and you can call Daddy whenever you need to. Understand?" Abby looked at her father's decisive action, her eyes wide with astonishment. For the first time, she saw her father not through a TV screen or praising articles, but as a flesh-and-blood man setting aside the whole world to protect her. Her small shoulders gradually relaxed. She tentatively raised her hand, touching her father's face, which was streaked with emotion, and then burst into tears, burying her head against his chest. Jonathan held her, soothing her slender back. While caressing her arm, his finger brushed against a strange mark on her sleeve cuff. He gently pulled up her sleeve. On the pale skin of her tiny arm were countless messy scribbles of numbers written in blue ballpoint pen. Not drawings of dolls or flowers, but detailed expense calculations down to the last penny, electricity bills, water bills, grandma's medication costs, grocery tabs. "What is this?" Jonathan whispered, the blood rushing to his face. Abby instinctively pulled her hand away, looking fearfully toward the upper floor. "Auntie made me write lines. She said I needed to know the value of money, how hard Daddy worked. She made me sit in Mommy and Daddy's room to write them. She called it the discipline room." Tiffany's handwriting. These numbers were not for an 8-year-old. This was the most refined form of psychological torture he had ever witnessed. Jonathan stood up, gripping Abby's small hand firmly. "Lead me up there. Right now." Father and daughter ascended the wooden staircase, heading towards the master bedroom at the end of the hall, a place Tiffany referred to as the forbidden zone, which she always kept locked when she went out. Jonathan placed his hand on the doorknob of his own room, feeling the coldness of the metal spread into his palm. He took a deep breath, preparing to confront the dark secrets hidden behind that glamorous door. The key turned with a definitive click. The heavy oak door swung open. Immediately, a strong scent overwhelmed Jonathan's nose, the expensive French rose perfume signature of Tiffany. Sweet, alluring, but in this context it was suffocating to the point of nausea, like the scent of a carefully embalmed corpse. Jonathan stepped into his stepwife's territory. The walls were covered with large wedding photos of the two of them. In the pictures, Tiffany gazed at him with admiration, and he looked back at her with absolute trust. Now those photos seemed to be looking down, mocking his naivety. He walked up to the vanity table. Dozens of cosmetic jars and perfume bottles were lined up neatly like an army. Jonathan ran his hand over them, recalling the times Tiffany would whine for more budget to maintain the chairman's wife's image, the times she subtly suggested he take longer business trips to expand the market and help more people. "You go ahead, I'll take care of things here at home. Mother and Abby are my responsibilities." Her sweet words echoed in his ears like the hiss of a snake. Every scattered piece of the past now clicked into place. His frequent charity trips weren't devotion. They were part of a perfect plan for her to eject him from the house. The anger within Jonathan didn't erupt into a shout. It settled, crystallizing into a cold, sharp block of ice. He began his search. He flung open the closets, flipping through layers of designer clothes. He checked under the bed behind the paintings. Nothing unusual. Everything was too clean, too orderly. But that very orderliness was her undoing. A woman who rushed off on a trip wouldn't leave a room this immaculate unless she had a separate place to hide her secrets. Jonathan's eyes paused at the small safe nestled in the corner of the room. This was where he usually kept emergency cash, but Tiffany didn't know the code. He knelt down, intending to check it, but his attention was caught by a small detail at the base of the safe. The floor tile right beneath the safe was slightly misaligned compared to the others. The gap was minuscule, no wider than a hair, but enough to catch the eye of a man suspicious of everything. Jonathan used his strength to shove the heavy safe aside. The metal scraped against the floor with a screech. Beneath the lifted tile was a small, expertly carved niche in the subfloor. Tucked inside was a gray metal box secured with a combination lock. Jonathan didn't waste time looking for a key or guessing the code. He ran downstairs, returning with a hammer and a chisel. Clang, clang, crack. The sound of shattering metal echoed shrilly in the silent room. The box lid flew open. Inside were a black leather-bound notebook and a few blister packs of pills. Jonathan picked up the notebook, flipping through the initial pages. The first thing he saw were careful, detailed entries of money. May 12th. Withdraw from charity fund. Reason mother's heart surgery fictional. Transfer to Bank of Mexico. $500,000. June 20th, Abbey Scholarship Fund, reason Swiss school tuition. Fictional, transfer to Cayman account $300,000. OCT 02, mansion repairs, reason roof, waterproofing fictional, cash $150. Each number, each line felt like a cut into Jonathan's pride. The money he painstakingly raised from benefactors to save lives had been laundered clean by her into offshore accounts to fund luxurious trips and expensive outfits. He tossed the notebook onto the bed and picked up the blister packs underneath. There were no labels, just small, pale blue tablets. As someone in the medical field, Jonathan instantly recognized the medication. High-dose Seduxin, an extremely potent sedative warned against for use in elderly patients with a history of heart issues and low blood pressure like his mother. Its side effects included deep sedation, respiratory suppression, and temporary memory loss. She was poisoning her, Jonathan whispered, his hands trembling violently. She had secretly mixed this drug into his mother's food to keep her unconscious all day to free herself up to go out to ensure his mother couldn't call for help. But the item at the very bottom of the box truly made Jonathan's heart stop a beat. He reached in and picked up a small red plastic object with a worn black strap. It was his mother's medical alert pendant. Jonathan remembered clearly the day he bought it. He had personally fastened it around her neck, showing her how to press the button. "Just press this, and the ambulance will come immediately, Mom. No matter where I am, I will know." And before leaving, he had instructed Tiffany repeatedly, "Make sure she always wears it." Tiffany had promised. She had sworn. Jonathan flipped the pendant over. The battery cover had been pried open. Inside was empty. The battery was gone. Everything went dark before Jonathan's eyes. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't oversight. This was the deliberate seizure of the right to live. She hadn't forgotten to put it on her. She had intentionally removed it, taken out the battery, and hidden it at the bottom of the secret compartment to ensure that even if his mother woke up during a drug-induced stupor, she would have absolutely no way to call for help. She wanted her to perish slowly in silence. Jonathan clenched the pendant in his hand. The sharp plastic edges dug painfully into his palm, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the storm raging in his soul. He didn't scream, nor did he smash anything. He just stood there, his chest heaving violently, his breath whistling through his clenched teeth like the growl of a wounded beast about to charge into a fight for survival. Ting, ting. The phone in Jonathan's pants pocket vibrated. He slowly took it out. A new message from Tiffany. "I'm about to land, my love. Such a long, tiring flight. Missing you and Abby so much. Is everything okay at home? How is Mother doing?" Dear Jonathan read the message, the corner of his mouth curling into a cold smile. He looked down at the pile of evidence strewn across the bed, the black notebook, the poisonous pills, the hollow pendant. "Everything is very well, Tiffany," he murmured. He tucked the pendant into his breast pocket right next to his heart, where the fire of vengeance burned brightest. He gathered the notebook and the pills into a plastic bag and began to clean up the scene. He placed the empty box back into the niche, pushed the safe back into its original position, and smoothed out the bed sheets. The room returned to its perfect, pristine state as if no one had ever trespassed. A flawless trap had been set, waiting only for the prey to step into it. Jonathan walked out of the room, closing the door. Click. The sound of the lock signified the end of a dramatic act and the beginning of a judgment. Jonathan's hand swiftly skimmed over the hardwood floor, returning the loose tile to its original place. He used his strength to push the heavy safe back, the metal screeching briefly before falling silent, completely concealing the dark niche that held the most brutal secret of his life. The black leather-bound notebook and the harmful pills were now securely inside a black plastic bag. Jonathan picked up the bag, feeling the immense weight, not physical, but the heavy burden of betrayal. He walked out of the master bedroom, locked the door carefully, and headed straight to his study. There, he stored the bag in his personal safe, twisting the combination lock. Now, all the evidence was in his hands. Jonathan descended the stairs where the security team he had hired was now fully assembled. Clean everything, he ordered, his voice so level it was chilling. I want the kitchen to look like no one has cooked there in a week. The living room, the hallway, everything must be spotless. Leave no trace of any disturbance. The security team worked quickly and professionally. In less than an hour, the mansion returned to its characteristic immaculate cold appearance. The bowls of chicken soup were cleared, Abby's toys neatly put away. The house donned its glamorous yet empty facade, once more ready to welcome its true owner home. Before the hour of reckoning, Jonathan needed to do one final thing. He asked the new nanny, a trustworthy middle-aged woman he had urgently hired to look after Abby. "Daddy will be back soon," Jonathan said, stroking his daughter's hair. "You stay in your room and watch cartoons, okay? Don't come out until I call you." Abby nodded obediently, her eyes still holding a little worry but much calmer now. Jonathan smiled reassuringly at her, then turned and walked out to the car. The car sped away in the twilight, heading toward Miller Hospital. In the intensive care unit, the air was thick with the scent of disinfectant and the regular whirring of machinery. Jonathan put on a protective gown and stepped inside. His mother lay there, tiny and frail as a dry leaf about to fall from a branch. Martha had regained consciousness. Her cloudy, tired eyes blinked slightly when she saw her son's silhouette. She couldn't speak, the breathing tube constricted her throat, but her eyes said everything that needed to be said. The pain, the fear, and above all, the boundless love for her only son. Jonathan took his mother's thin hand tangled with IV lines. The hand that once strongly navigated their family was now icy cold and weak. He could feel her life slipping through his fingers second by second. He didn't cry. Tears were a luxurious weakness at this moment. He leaned down close to his mother's ear, whispering promises only the two of them could hear. "I will clean out the trash from our home, Mother. Everything that caused you pain, I will make them pay. Please wait for me just a little longer." Martha blinked softly. A single clear tear rolled down from the corner of her wrinkled eye, soaking the pillow. That was her nod, her acceptance, her forgiveness for the son who had inadvertently invited the wolf into their home. Jonathan stood up, kissed his mother's forehead one last time, and resolutely walked out. He didn't dare look back, fearing that weakness might pull him down. Leaving the hospital, the sky was already dark. Jonathan stopped at a roadside florist. "I need a bouquet of white lilies." "The most beautiful you have," he told the florist. The saleswoman quickly wrapped the pristine white lilies, releasing their heady fragrance. Jonathan held the bouquet, taking a deep breath. He remembered Tiffany intensely disliked this scent. She always complained it was too strong, too old-fashioned. But this was his mother's favorite flower. He placed the bouquet on the passenger seat and drove home. His mindset now was no longer that of a husband waiting for his wife, but a judge on his way to deliver the final verdict. Arriving home, the clock read 6:30 p.m. Jonathan called Abby to her room. "Put on your headphones and watch a cartoon. Okay, Daddy needs to have a talk with Aunt Tiffany for a bit. Remember my words, absolutely do not take off your headphones." "Yes, Daddy," Abby replied, complying obediently. Jonathan closed his daughter's door and walked alone down to the vast living room. He didn't turn on the usual dazzling crystal chandelier. He only lit the fireplace. The flames flickered in the hearth, casting dancing orange and yellow light onto his face, which was set hard as a statue. He poured himself a glass of deep red wine, the color of blood, the color of his suppressed fury. He sat down on the sofa facing the front door and waited. 7 p.m. The sound of a taxi engine echoed from outside the iron gate, shattering the mansion's silence. The headlights swept across the living room windows like the eyes of a monster scrutinizing its lair. The heavy front door opened. Tiffany stepped inside, pulling a large suitcase behind her. She was still wearing a brightly patterned beach maxi dress with vivid tropical flowers, her hair in bouncy curls and her skin healthy. And tanned, her appearance carried the breath of the sunny beaches of Mexico, a complete contrast to the gloomy, cold atmosphere and the strong scent of lilies filling the house. She took a few steps into the foyer, intending to continue her performance as the dutiful wife and daughter-in-law returning from a long trip. But then her steps stalled. In the flickering light of the fireplace, Tiffany saw her husband's silhouette. Jonathan sat silently on the sofa, his back ramrod straight, holding the glass of red wine. He didn't stand up to greet her, nor did he smile. His eyes were deep and dark, staring unblinkingly at her like a predator locking onto its target. Tiffany swallowed hard, her throat dry. A chill ran down her spine, but the performer's instinct in her surged. She forced a strained smile, stepping closer, intending to lean down and kiss his cheek. "My love, why are you sitting in the dark like this?" "You gave me quite a start." Jonathan didn't flinch, nor did he return the casual kiss. He slowly raised the wine glass to eye level, tilting his wrist slightly so the red liquid swirled in the crystal glass. "Your little trip to pick up medicine in Mexico looks like it was fun, doesn't it?" His voice was deep, resounding in the empty room, shattering the pretense of silence. Tiffany froze. The smile on her face extinguished like a snuffed candle. "Mexico," Tiffany repeated the word, her voice losing its pitch. She stood rooted in the living room, her eyes wide as saucers staring blankly at Jonathan. The hand she had reached out to touch her husband's shoulder hung suspended in midair before slowly dropping to her side. Her suitcase slipped from her grasp, falling heavily onto the hardwood floor. Thud. The weighty sound echoed like a hammer blow in the tense atmosphere. But Tiffany wasn't one to surrender easily. She quickly regained her composure, the survival instinct of a practiced liar surging powerfully. She blinked repeatedly, attempting to project an expression of innocence mixed with offense. "What are you talking about, Jonathan?" "What Mexico?" She stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder, her voice sweet yet trembling. "I was just kidding to surprise you, darling. I really went to the southern border, but it was to find a new heart tonic for Mother. You know how much I care for her." Seeing Jonathan remain motionless, completely unmoved, Tiffany began to panic. She needed to evade that cold, sharp gaze. She needed an excuse to escape this confrontation. "Well, anyway, I'm exhausted. I'm going up to check on Mother now. She must be waiting for me." She spun around quickly, heading for the stairs. As she went, she called out loudly, her voice echoing through the empty house. "Mother, your daughter-in-law is home. I bought you a silk scarf." The clack-clack of her heels on the wooden stairs sounded rushed and frantic, like the chaotic beating of her heart. Tiffany dashed upstairs, heading straight for Martha's room at the end of the hall. She twisted the doorknob. The door swung wide open. The room was utterly empty. The bedding was flat, the sheets pristine white. No ventilator, no smell of medicine, and most importantly, no Martha. Tiffany stood frozen in the doorway. The silence of the empty room was like a slap across her face. Ah, she shrieked hysterically, covering her face, then turned and sprinted back downstairs. This time, tears were truly streaming down her heavily made-up face, perfect crocodile tears. Jonathan. Where is Mother? Why is her room empty? She rushed up to her husband, wailing. Did the staff do something to her, or kidnappers? "Oh my goodness, I was only gone for a few days. Please say something." Jonathan remained seated on the sofa, sipping his wine, savoring the bitter taste on his tongue. He watched the clumsy performance unfolding before him with utter contempt. She was still acting. Even now, with the truth clearly visible, she was still trying to play the role of the victimized, devoted daughter-in-law. He didn't answer her question. Instead, he slowly placed the wine glass on the table, then turned his head toward the dark corner of the living room, hidden behind the heavy velvet curtain. "Come out now, sweetie." A small figure stepped out of the shadows. Abby. She wore a pale pink nightgown, clutching her old teddy bear tightly. Abby was no longer trembling, no longer huddled in fear as she had been the night before. She stood beside her father, her chin raised, looking directly at Tiffany. Her innocent, clear eyes now held no fear, but instead a chilling accusation. When Tiffany saw Abby, her complexion shifted from flushed red to ghostly white. The child's presence was something she hadn't anticipated. She had assumed the girl would be locked in her room or too terrified to dare show herself. Jonathan stood up. He was tall, completely dwarfing the woman standing before him. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a shiny cluster of metal keys. Clang! He tossed the keys onto the glass coffee table. The cold sound of metal striking glass echoed. "The key to Mother's room," Jonathan stated, his voice low. "I found it in the Hermes handbag you left behind before you left. You locked Mother and Tiffany. You secured her like an animal." Tiffany stumbled back a step, her hip hitting the edge of the coffee table hard. She winced in pain but didn't dare cry out. Her eyes darted frantically, searching for an excuse. I didn't mean to. I just didn't want strangers bothering her while she rested. I was under so much pressure, Jonathan." She began to stammer, her voice shaky and choked. "You don't understand how exhausting it is caring for a bedridden person. I was depressed. I was so stressed out. I just needed a little space. I only went away for a few days to get my head straight." She attempted to shrink inward, turning herself into a pathetic, weak victim of life's pressures. Jonathan didn't utter a word. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, connecting it to the large television screen mounted in the center of the living room. Beep. The TV screen flared to life. A massive photo appeared, filling the entire space. Tiffany in her vibrant red bikini, smiling radiantly, raising a cocktail glass under the dazzling Mexican sun. The caption was clearly visible. "Freedom. Finally escaping the stinky nursing home." The contrast between the image of the glamorous, hedonistic woman on the screen and the woman cowering and weeping hysterically in the living room was truly cruel. Tiffany stared intently at the TV screen. That photo was a death sentence for all her lies. She knew she couldn't deny the lavish trip anymore. The mask dropped. Tiffany sank to her knees on the floor. She crawled towards Jonathan's legs, tears and snot blurring her expensive makeup. "Honey, forgive me. I made a mistake. It was a moment of foolish impulsiveness. I swear I still care about Mother and Abby. I just needed to blow off some steam." She wailed, her voice cracking with panic. "Don't leave me. I'll change. I'll take better care of Mother." Jonathan stood still as a stone statue. He looked down at the woman clinging to his leg. His eyes held no trace of affection, only sheer disgust. He slowly pried her fingers from his trousers one by one, decisively removing her like something filthy clinging to him. "The issue isn't the trip, Tiffany," Jonathan said, his voice cold as ice. "The issue is what you left behind." He stepped back, creating distance between them. He reached into his breast pocket where his heart hammered with fury. He pulled out a neatly folded handkerchief. Within that soft cloth lay the final piece of evidence, the coup de grace for this marriage built on deception. The white handkerchief was slowly unfurled. Resting in Jonathan's palm was not an expensive piece of jewelry like in past reconciliation attempts, but a small gray metal box with its lid forcibly pried open. Tiffany's eyes glazed over. She recognized it instantly. It was the secret box she had hidden under the bedroom floor, containing the darkest evidence of her double life. "You," Tiffany stammered, her voice catching in her throat. "You searched through my things." Jonathan didn't reply. He picked up the black leather notebook from the box, held it up high, and then let go. Thud. The notebook fell right at Tiffany's feet, the pages flipping open, exposing the densely written financial calculations. The fund for heart surgery for impoverished children, the orphan scholarship fund, the foundation for repairing shelters. Jonathan read out each entry, his voice calm but chillingly devoid of warmth. "It turns out all of it flowed into your Hermes handbags, into five-star resort getaways, into your champagne parties." Tiffany lunged for the notebook, but Jonathan was quicker. He pulled a blister pack of pale blue pills from his jacket pocket. the unlabeled medication she had hidden so carefully. And this, Jonathan said, crushing a pill between his fingers. White powder rained down onto the polished hardwood floor right beside Tiffany's high heels. High-dose Seduxin, a drug contraindicated for the elderly with heart failure. You mixed it into my mother's food every day, didn't you? To keep her deeply sedated so you were free to get your nails done and go shopping. Cornered. Tiffany's pathetic, pleading look vanished instantly. In its place was a furious rage. She sprang to her feet, completely discarding the facade of docility she had maintained for so long. "So what?" Tiffany screamed, her face flushed crimson. "You think I wanted this? You were gone all the time you abandoned this house to me. Your mother was bedridden, her hygiene, her meals, her medications. Do you know how disgusting the smell of an old sick person is? I am your wife, not this family's private nurse. I deserve to enjoy life. That money is the recompense for my efforts in taking care of this decaying family." She sneered, pointing a challenging finger at Jonathan. "What are you going to do to me? Put me in the slammer." "You have no proof I intentionally took action against her. It was just an oversight. I forgot the key. I forgot to tell the staff. At most, it's negligent endangerment. I'll hire the best lawyer to clear my name. And you, if you dare touch me, I'll splash everything across the media." That national philanthropist. Jonathan Miller mistreated his wife, neglected his elderly mother. Let's see who loses more than Jonathan silently listened to his wife's frantic monologue. He didn't argue, nor did he raise his voice. He simply reached into his inner pocket, retrieving the final piece of evidence, the red plastic medical alert pendant. The moment she saw it, Tiffany went mute. Her pupils constricted. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Jonathan held the pendant up high under the glistening crystal chandelier. "You say you were merely negligent." He used his thumb to flick open the battery cover on the back of the pendant. Click. The cap popped off easily. It was empty inside. No battery. A negligent person might forget a key, but a negligent person does not remove the battery from a bedridden patient's life-saving device and then bury it under the floorboards. Jonathan stated, his voice low, definitive as a death sentence. "This wasn't negligence, Tiffany. This was premeditated deprivation. You stole the only chance my mother had to survive." He tossed the empty pendant onto the floor. The sound of plastic shattering ended all of Tiffany's hope of denial. "And if you think that's not enough," Jonathan turned to Abby. "Daughter, tell your aunt what you told Daddy." Abby took a deep breath, her small hands clutching her teddy bear. She took a step forward, facing the woman who had instilled terror in her for the past 2 years. "Auntie said I couldn't call Daddy," Abby said, her voice trembling, but every word clear. "She said if I called, Daddy would lose focus and the little children would pass away. She threatened that if I ate too much, I was a person who harmed others. She secured me in the dark room if I dared sneak in to visit Grandma." The words of the 8-year-old child resonated in the spacious room, innocent yet sharper than any adult accusation. Tiffany staggered backward, bumping into the sofa. She looked at Abby, then at the shattered pendant on the floor. She knew she had lost everything. Jonathan nodded subtly toward the side door leading to his study. The door opened. A stern man in a black suit entered, placing a thick file on the coffee table. "My personal attorney, Jonathan," introduced briefly. "Inside this file is the criminal complaint I've prepared. Charges include severe physical harm, elder mistreatment, child endangerment, and embezzlement. With this evidence, plus the testimony of the head physician and Abby, my lawyer estimates you'll face about 15 to 20 years in a correctional facility. No possibility of bail." Tiffany looked at the file, then at the front door, where 2 massive bodyguards stood with crossed arms blocking the exit. She understood there was no escape. The arrogance and defiance from moments ago dissolved like soap bubbles, leaving only the sheer terror of potential incarceration. Her knees buckled. She sank onto the sofa, her entire body trembling. Jonathan slid another piece of paper toward her, placing it right next to the indictment file. "But I'm giving you one other option." Jonathan laid the gold-plated fountain pen on the glass table right next to the fragile divorce papers. "Sign here," he said, his voice cold and devoid of warmth. "You will leave this house immediately with only the clothes you are wearing. No assets, no alimony, no division of anything. You vanish from my life, my daughter's life, and my mother's life forever. In exchange, I will keep this entire matter quiet, foregoing criminal prosecution to preserve the last shred of dignity for the Miller name you have tarnished." Tiffany looked up at her husband. In her eyes was a fierce struggle between greed and fear. On one side was the luxurious life she had always craved. On the other, the cold bars of a prison cell. You're sending me away with nothing," she whispered, her voice choked with regret. "I gave my best years to this house. You have 30 seconds to decide." Jonathan interrupted, glancing at his watch. "Either sign or I call the sheriff in here right now. He's waiting at the gate." The living room door cracked open. The flashing blue and red lights of a police vehicle reflected through the gap like a final warning. Tiffany shuddered. She frantically snatched the pen. Her hand shook so violently she nearly dropped it. She looked around the opulent mansion one last time. The art pieces, the genuine leather sofa, the crystal chandelier. All the things that had once been hers now slipping from her grasp forever. But the fear of prison was greater than everything else. She put the pen to the paper. A messy, distorted signature appeared on the line, marked "Consent to Divorce." As soon as the pen left the paper, Jonathan snatched the document back, handing it to the lawyer to put in his briefcase. "It's done. Escort her out." He ordered the security team, not sparing Tiffany another glance. The two large bodyguards stepped forward, lifting Tiffany to her feet. "Wait. My suitcase. My belongings." Tiffany screamed, struggling to reach the luggage filled with the designer clothes she had just bought in Mexico. "That is stolen money," Jonathan said. "It stays here." Tiffany was roughly dragged toward the front door. Outside, a heavy rain poured down. A sudden summer downpour descended relentlessly, just like the night Jonathan returned. "Let me go, you cruel man. You have no right to do this to me." Tiffany's shouts were swallowed by the sound of the rain. She was forcefully shoved out of the iron gate. The fall sent her sprawling into the muddy puddle outside. Her vibrant maxi dress was soiled with dirt, her curled hair plastered to her tear-streaked face. The sight of her scrambling to get up in the rain was pathetic and disheveled, a complete contradiction to the sophisticated image of her when she had walked into the house less than an hour earlier. Jonathan stood by the window, looking through the rain-soaked glass. He watched Tiffany screaming, pounding on the locked iron gate, but no one responded. She stood there for a moment, then turned away dejectedly, disappearing into the pitch-black night. He pulled the heavy velvet curtain shut. Swish. The door to the past was closed. The troublemaker was gone. Jonathan turned back to the living room. Abby was still standing there, clutching her teddy bear, looking at her father with worry. He walked over, picked his daughter up, and held her tightly. "It's over, sweetie. Your aunt is gone. No one will frighten you anymore." Abby wrapped her arms around her father's neck, burying her head into his shoulder. "Daddy is Grandma coming home to us." His daughter's innocent question wrenched Jonathan's heart. Before he could answer, the landline phone rang. The jarring sound pierced the quiet atmosphere. It was the number for the hospital. Jonathan's hand trembled as he picked up. "Hello? I'm listening." On the other end, the somber voice of Dr. Roberts spoke. "Jonathan, I'm very sorry to deliver this news." The phone slipped from Jonathan's grasp, falling onto the hardwood floor, but not shattering the coiled cord swinging back and forth. The doctor's voice still echoed from the receiver lying on the floor. She passed away very peacefully. Her body was too weak to endure anymore. Jonathan slowly knelt down. His knees hit the hard floor painfully, but he felt nothing. His mother was gone. She had waited for him to clean up the house, waited for him to dismiss that wicked woman, and only then did she let go. She kept her promise, waiting for him to fulfill his duty as a son, a head of the family, before gently departing. Daddy Abby frantically shook his shoulder. "What's wrong?" Jonathan covered his face, tears streaming through his fingers. He had won the battle against Tiffany. He had reclaimed his assets, his reputation, and his daughter. But he had lost the most important fight, keeping his mother alive. Money, power, the title of philanthropist, all became meaningless in the face of his mother's passing. He realized he had been too preoccupied with saving strangers, only to neglect the most important person who slowly died in loneliness right in her own home. Grandma has gone far away," Sweetie Jonathan choked out to Abby. Father and daughter sat on the cold floor amidst the vast empty living room, holding each other and weeping. The rain outside continued to pour, as if mourning a life and washing away the sins of the past. The next morning, Jonathan stood up from the floor, his eyes swollen, but his gaze now resolute. He walked over to the makeshift memorial altar for his mother, lighting a stick of incense. He turned to his desk, picked up his phone, and began drafting an email. Recipient: the Board of Directors of Miller Care Group. Subject: resignation. The body contained only a few short lines. I resign as executive chairman effective today. I need to dedicate my time to the things that truly matter, which I have neglected. He pressed send. Jonathan walked to the window, pulling aside the heavy velvet curtain he had closed the night before. The morning sunlight flooded the room, dispelling the lingering darkness and coldness. He looked out at the garden where rosebuds were beginning to open after the night's rain. A new beginning awaited him and Abby. A life without long trips, without superficial accolades, only genuine presence and love. He turned off the living room light. The darkness of despair retreated, yielding to the light of self-awareness. 6 months passed. The relentless rain of that fateful night seemed to have washed away the gloom that clung to Jonathan and his daughter's lives. Now the sky above the suburban cemetery was a clear sapphire blue with golden afternoon sun casting a gentle glow on the lush green lawns. Jonathan stood silently before Martha's newly erected gravestone. He no longer wore the expensive, impeccably smooth Italian suits of the powerful CEO. Today he wore only a simple linen shirt, his sleeves rolled up, revealing skin slightly tanned, a mark of the days he had spent gardening and repairing the house. He gently placed the bouquet of white lilies on the cold stone slab. His mother's favorite flowers released a soft fragrance blending into the breeze. Jonathan touched the headstone, feeling an invisible connection. He didn't speak aloud, but in his heart he whispered a belated apology and his gratitude for the forgiveness she had given him until her last breath. A soft wind blew through, stirring the white petals, bringing a strange sense of tranquility. Jonathan closed his eyes, inhaling the scent of the earth. The past 6 months had been a painful yet worthwhile journey of recovery from workaholism. He learned to let go of all-night meetings and long flights, to learn how to be a real single father, a profession he realized was more challenging and noble than running a corporation. "Grandma, the daisies at home are blooming now." Abby's clear voice rang out beside him, pulling Jonathan back to reality. She stood there, noticeably taller, her cheeks rosy with health, showing no trace of the thin, fearful child hiding in the kitchen corner. Abby naturally took a cloth and wiped small specks of dust from the headstone, her movements tender and full of affection. "Let's go home, sweetie," Jonathan smiled, taking her hand. "We still have one flower bed to finish planting." The old car carried father and daughter away from the cemetery, driving toward their new home. It wasn't the lavish lakeside mansion anymore, but a modest house tucked under an old oak tree, always filled with light and laughter. Arriving home, father and daughter rolled up their sleeves, heading straight for the small garden in front of the porch. Jonathan and Abby didn't mind getting mud on their clothes, working together to turn the soil to plant bright yellow daisies. This was his grandmother's favorite flower, its yellow symbolizing warmth and reunion. As the sunset began to fall, painting the garden, purple Jonathan dusted off his hands, calling his daughter close to the long wooden bench on the porch. "Abby, I have something for you." He pulled a small velvet-wrapped gift box from his pocket. Abby opened it, her eyes lighting up with delight. Inside was not an expensive diamond or gem, but a simple handcrafted silver locket. Jonathan helped her fasten the necklace. Abby curiously flipped open the locket. Inside were two tiny, expertly cut photos, one side showing Grandma Martha smiling kindly, the other showing Jonathan embracing Abby tightly. "It's beautiful, Daddy," Abby exclaimed, running her fingers over the pendant. Jonathan knelt on one knee on the porch floor, bringing his eye level with his daughter's. He held her small hands, still stained with garden soil, looking deeply into her clear brown eyes. "I promise," Jonathan's voice was warm and firm. "From now on, I won't go off to save the world anywhere far away. I've realized that my own little world right here," he gently touched Abby's cheek, "is the place that needs the most protection and love. I will be here until I am certain my world is safe and happy." Abby smiled a radiant grin like the sunshine, dispelling all remaining shadows in her soul. She threw her arms around her father's neck. "I love you, Daddy." Father and daughter walked hand in hand into the house. Their shadows stretched long across the green lawn, merging into a single strong entity. Jonathan closed the front door, but then he walked to the window and threw it wide open. The evening breeze swept in, carrying the scent of daisies and warm sunlight. The new house no longer held locked secrets or dark corners. Only genuine care and the light of freedom filled the space, healing old wounds and signaling a truly peaceful new life. Final note on the story's message. The story of Jonathan Miller is a sharp wake-up call regarding the savior complex, reminding us that social accolades are meaningless if the price is the collapse of one's family. Jonathan made a grave error by using money and blind trust to outsource love, inadvertently turning his own negligence into an accomplice to cruelty. He learned the painful lesson that charity begins at home. The narrative conveys a profound educational message. Don't be so consumed with saving strangers that you leave your loved ones in the dark, because genuine presence and time are the most valuable assets, things that once lost no fortune can ever buy back. Disclaimer: the preceding narrative is entirely fictional. Character names, locations, and events were created for the purpose of illustrating an educational message and artistic expression. Any resemblance to real people or actual events is purely coincidental.